So good morning. Somewhat to my surprise, I find myself here again moderating this session, which is great. We're very happy now to have two of our colleagues from Brno, and the first will be Karel Stibral. I'm sorry, I don't really know much about you, so I can't really introduce you very much, but it's lovely to have you here anyway, so over to you.
Thank you very much. So maybe short introduction. I'm from Brno, from Masaryk University, Department of Environmental Studies. 15 years. I'm just a member of this department, but I studied aesthetics. I'm an aesthetician by training, and then I studied history and philosophy of sciences here at the Faculty of Science and Charles University. So this lecture will be maybe on crossroad of this disciplines, maybe some strange disciplines, but yeah. Johann Georg Sulzer, The Beauty of Nature Between Science and God. This presentation aims to recall and describe in some detail reflections on the beauty of nature in modern thought, especially in the 18th century. This century played a major role in the establishment of aesthetics as a philosophical discipline, as well as in the rather radical transformation of tastes in relation to natural sceneries. In this context, I would like to highlight one of Johann Georg Sulzer's works, which was the very first monograph on the beauty of nature. And which offers an alternative, albeit not an entirely successful one, to the Enlightenment way of thinking at the time. Simultaneously, and surprisingly, this monograph foreshadowed the issues dealt with environmental aesthetics of the final decades of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. The beauty of nature, whether the beauty of the whole universe or individual natural objects and organisms, has been present not only in philosophical thought since Greek antiquity. Indeed, interest in the beauty of nature has been a tradition in Europe and around the whole world, not only thinkers, but among also artists and highly educated segments of population. However, the question is, what is it in nature that has actually been aesthetically appreciated? If we set aside certain exceptions, then, as can be attested from various sources, early on aesthetic appreciation, and I emphasize aesthetic appreciation, not merely interest or attention, was reserved mainly for cultivated nature, for gardens and fields, in the form of an ideal Arcadian pastoral landscape. This changed considerably in the 18th century, when rather suddenly admiration shifted to wild terrains such as mountains and forests, which until then had been considered uninteresting or even off-putting sceneries. The discovery of the aesthetic qualities of mountainous terrains especially has generated a large body of scholarship and popularizing literature. Maybe only only about mountains. It's a beginning of the reading about aesthetic of mountains. So we will have to aside. Nevertheless, the 18th century also brought a major transformation in thinking about the aesthetic qualities of nature in the field of philosophy, or rather in aesthetics, which by the middle of the century had become a separate discipline. At the time, one's aesthetic experiences in nature were much emphasized in defining aesthetic experience in general, and this trend culminated in Kant's critique of judgment. Additionally, the 18th century saw a break with the traditional association of beauty with proportion, perfection, and utility, symmetry, etc. We will continue. Generally, a gradual departure took place from the existing tradition based on the idea of nature as God's creation. This departure wasn't so radical in the overall perspective or approach of individual thinkers, but mainly in the ways it was used in their argumentation. More and more, they relied on subjective psychological experiences and on the new scientific discoveries of the time. As I said, for philosophers reflecting on beauty in the 18th century, it was characteristic to strongly emphasize one's experience with nature. But an interesting transformation took place in how people conceived of nature and where nature beauty or sublimity resides. As early as the beginning of the 18th century, in the Moralists, Lord of Shaftesbury centered his thoughts on the beauty of free nature, emphasizing that this is how it was created by God. In this, Shaftesbury foreshadowed Rousseau's similar approach, but without Rousseau's fundamental condemnation of civilization. However, Shaftesbury also anticipated or directly initiated a number of other seemingly disparate topics: the English landscape park, the notion of the noble savage, and the understanding of the aesthetic experience as disinterested pleasure. Nevertheless, all these topics are based on appreciation of free nature. Only a few years later, Joseph Edison published a text in which he, like Shaftesbury, promoted free nature and a new, freer type of garden. But Edison's argumentation already draws on Locke's philosophy. The reason for the aesthetic superiority of nature over art is mainly nature's ability to be more variable and its free form and to provide more food for our senses. In Britain, the later work of the prominent politician Edmund Burke then represented a certain culmination of these developments. Like Edison, Burke elevated nature above art. But in his argumentation, Burke then relied exclusively on what Baumgarten also believed, that aesthetic perception is the domain of emotions, not reason, and that it is derived from our psychological and biological foundations. A major idea to which Burke devoted extensive discussion was his dissolution of the association of beauty with regularity, utility, and symmetry. According to Burke, these are primarily judgments of reason, not emotions. Such a view further supported the contemporary transformation of tastes that expressed a growing appreciation for, as the theorist Andrews put it, aggressively anti-utilitarian sceneries and sceneries that were irregular, disorderly, and untouched by humans. This stream of thought was then brought to its peak, even though at somewhat different philosophical level, by Kant, and perhaps also by Schiller. It's a pity that the attempt made by Swiss philosopher and natural scientist Johann Georg Sulzer to thematize the aesthetics of nature as a special area of aesthetics didn't gain much attention at the time. As the author of the extensive Allgemeine Theorie der schönen Künste, Sulzer became a founding figure of general theory of the fine arts and aesthetics in the Age of Enlightenment. Nevertheless, his early works on the aesthetics of nature has received surprisingly little attention, even recently from those who have written about him. This is surprising because, in part, Sulzer anticipated the argumentation of the aestheticians in the second half of the 20th century, who, after a longish pause, became interested in the aesthetic qualities of nature. After a period of intense interest in the aesthetic of nature within philosophical aesthetics, the level of interest in this area declined sharply. Aesthetics was then seen essentially as a philosophy of art until the late 60s and 1970s, when the environmental aesthetics appeared on the scene. Like Sulzer, but unaware of his work, environmental aesthetics distinguishes the aesthetic experience with nature from the aesthetic experience with art. Further, it bases the aesthetic experience with nature on our knowledge of the sciences, departing from the understanding as it had been represented by Kant and Burke. However, in Sulzer's work, there is also an attempt to reconcile the sciences with the very traditional belief that beautiful nature has been created by God. Both Kant and Burke had avoided such a connection. By far, and environmental aestheticians completely discount any religious connotations. And now, at least briefly, about Sulzer and his work. His dialogues on the beauty of nature were published in 1750 the same year as Baumgarten's Aesthetica, the founding work of aesthetics as a discipline. Drawing on certain themes from his earlier work, Sulzer develops his argumentation on why it is essential to pay attention to nature's aesthetic qualities and what forms the foundations of nature's beauty. Unlike Berg or Kant, Sulzer doesn't build his arguments on the subjective experience of nature, and he doesn't stray from traditional ideas linking beauty with symmetry or usefulness. Instead, as I have said, Sulzer tries to build on knowledge of the senses. According to him, it is this type of knowledge that leads to a higher and true appreciation of nature's beauty. Such a view makes Sulzer an interesting predecessor to Carlson's environmental aesthetics, as I have said. Carlson looks to the sciences for help because the sciences focus on nature directly, and so, as he sees it, they don't deform our view of nature by what we have learned through art. For Sulzer, the sciences are fundamental because they open up deeper insights into God's work, insights that a more superficial view would overlook. Sulzer's dialogues, or Unterredungen, is a kind of pedagogical introduction to admiring nature. It is written as a dialogue, in which one friend, Eucrates, tries to turn other friend, Charites, into a lover and admirer of nature. At the very beginning, Sulzer declares the fundamental importance of our perception of nature, especially of free nature. In fact, Sulzer is no fan of dangerous wilderness like Kant and Berg. It is in its visible form, Sulzer appreciates especially the type of nature that is in what we might call the classicizing Arcadian style, free of extremes, with a somewhat rolling terrain and with wide views into a lovely and diverse cultural landscape. Sulzer perceives in nature primarily kindness, or this park. And even though he mentions the nature may have also somewhat turbulent aspects, as for instance in the rapids of stream, he keeps returning to nature in a more stable, calmer form. This is because our spirit should also be calm and quiet to perceive nature's beauty. Our mind is usually occupied with various worries, such as politics, etc., filling the mind with unease, which is not only unpleasant, but also blinds us to nature's beauty. To truly enjoy nature's most beautiful image, and our spirit should be like the spirit of the innocent child. Was the same with the former papers. Sulzer gives the example of rough waters which reflect neither the landscape nor the heavens. Only calm waters create a beautiful painting. In this way, pure images of nature are painted only on quiet souls. Despite his fascination with scenic beauty, Sulzer's aesthetic appreciation of nature is not limited merely to its visual qualities. It also involves experiencing nature with all the senses. In other words, he mentions the frequently cited difference in environmental aesthetics between perceiving nature and perceiving works of art. But in fact, beauty is not based solely on sensual qualities. For Sulzer, nature is primarily God's work. The beauty that attracts us to nature, these are the rays of the expression of the original beauty. The beauty that we experience through perceiving color, light, and shadow, and the forms of nature that can be perceived by our senses, this is only the lower level of beauty. Our goal is to discover the hidden, deeper level of beauty, and this must be discovered by our spirit. Even though Sulzer talks mainly about a lower and a higher type of beauty in general, at one point he divides beauty into three levels, or three kinds of recipients. The first kind are the lowest or shallowest recipients who perceive only the simple or sensual types of beauty and enjoy only things that are novel, unexpected, and wonderful. The second kind are deep recipients who especially enjoy the type of beauty that springs from proportion and order. But for the third, the deepest kind of recipients, the most limitless joys flows from examining the hidden art and wisdom of nature. Even though in his later, more important works, Sulzer deals primarily with the fine arts in dialogues, Unterredungen, he considers the main source of beauty to be nature. After all, nature is God's work. In this respect, Sulzer refers to the well-known British philosopher Francis Hutcheson and his division of beauty into two types: absolute beauty, which lies in nature, and relative beauty, which lies in art. When, in Unterredungen, the character Caritas tries to argue that, for instance, a statue made by a skillful master is more inventive and better proportioned than plants or animals, his friend Eucrates points out that artists too take all proportions from nature. Human art is only an infinitely tiny part of nature. There is nothing in works of art that is not already present in nature. Nature, in essence, is absolutely harmonious, and all forms are interconnected. This seems to be quite a common idea based on the innumerable connections and reciprocities between all living and non-living things. But, surprisingly, Sulzer understands this interconnection of forms mostly taxonomically, cladistically, and hierarchically. He doesn't so much analyze the individual structure or formal aspects of animal or plants anatomy that would be an outer level. Rather, he focuses on the integration of the individual species into the system. In other words, on the integration of the individual species into the hidden and deeper harmony. Sulzer begins his discussions of this ordering within hidden nature mainly by highlighting the ingenious organization of this type of nature into classes or families, each of which has its own particular, yet always harmonious proportions and sizes. Each class or family has its own characteristic, its particular place of occurrence, and its special way of life. These related families form small republics, and they together then form one large state or even a monarchy. In this context, Sulzer offers more detailed examples of various species of gentians and also of various species of animals. He doesn't borrow quite all of the taxonomical groups from Linné's Systema Naturae, and so he uses the terms referring to political structures is directed toward highlighting the unified laws within each small state, each republic, and each kingdom. Within the monarchy of plants, the same laws apply to oaks as do grasses or tulips or gentians. For instance, all plants have the same basic parts, whether it's a hyssop or cedar of Lebanon, and it is the same for animals. Each of the three main parts, state, republic, and kingdom of nature, today we distinguish 6 kingdoms, is then further divided into the other subgroups. Each subgroup has additional specific rules, its particular types of transformation of the basic patterns, and its own special organization of relationship and setting of proportions. What richness of not only forms, but also rules and transformations of the rules. However, the relationships between individual taxa, states, and families of the infinite monarchy are, of course, not only hierarchical, they are interconnected and infinitely varied. Each animal and plant has its own needs and its own tendencies. Here, Sulzer points to what would in modern terms call diverse food chains, as well as the particular specialization and strategies of aquatic animals. These specializations and strategies that influence the animal's morphology, the proportions of their bodies, for instance, depending on whether they hunt for food above or underwater, and so on. In these passages, Sulzer refers to the study of taxonomy, which was flourishing at the time, but he draws also on the study of the structural elements of plants and animals organisms, which was soon to develop into classical morphology, and on the paradigmatic and comparative study of body plans, which would fascinate upcoming generation of natural scientists, much like issues regarding development in terms of ontogenesis and species evolution. Sulzer's thoughts on the interconnections of the species and on the species-varied relations with the environment then foreshadow the biological discipline of ecology. Simultaneously, the differences separating one species from another are practically unnoticeable. Everything forms a harmonious whole. This whole is hierarchical because everything is organized into the one long continual chain. We find here the traditional idea of scala naturae, an idea that was widely shared in Sulzer's time. Sulzer's influences, such as Leibniz, often mention this idea. The beauty of creation is based, among other things, on this so-called chain, or the ladder, kette, or creation, from the simplest creatures to the most complex ones. All species fit together, build on one another, and not a single species may be taken out. If even one single species were to be taken out, all of nature would eventually die out. However, such insights, like those regarding proper proportions, will not be obvious to everyone who observes nature. Those who want to see and experience higher joy from nature's beauty must have knowledge and must be taught, especially about the sciences. Interdisciplinary has been quoted by many more natural scientists than artists or philosophers. One's understanding of proper proportion and one's knowledge of nature is then applied when perceiving works of art. Those who cannot grasp the beautiful proportions of the human body will not experience joy from the most beautiful of statues. Either amazement at the beauty and ordering of nature can lead all the way to religious ecstasy. Nature is holy, a sanctuary. Nature's beauty lies also in the inner working of each species, or in other words, their design. In this too, nature is primarily a model for art. In fact, art and technology are nothing else but imitation of nature. Sulzer here elaborates on then compares works of nature with works of technology. For him, organisms are, at a certain level, machines that significantly surpass the works of human art. He talks in this context about the famous Wilkinson's duck. But in Sulzer's time, the metaphor of an organism as a mechanism was one of the basic approaches to thinking about the bodies. But in fact, Sulzer sometimes is supported this approach, and the other hand, talks about animals as machines, but on the other hand, he talks that the living being is something very different than machines, so we could think about it with some wondering. But Sulzer then offers an idea which is in certain degree comparable to Leibniz's monadology, even though Sulzer doesn't cite Leibniz here. While human-made machines can be disassembled into parts that cannot be further divided, with organisms it is different. The view through the microscope had shown that each organism mechanism is composed of other mechanisms, and those of other mechanisms, etc., etc. Of course, such fascinating ordering inspires further feelings of beauty and strong emotions. Just as the microscope reveals the microcosm, the telescope reveals the amazing order of the macrocosm. And so we find here a comparison of the works of nature and art, which is similar to the comparison offered in Ronald Hamberg's groundbreaking article, maybe article which started the thinking about nature within the aesthetics field. And it's quite close to the same passages, maybe not the same, but similar passages in just mentioned Theodor Adorno aesthetic theory from 1970s. There are several pages about beauty, natural beauty, and it's also then the accent is on the differentiation between appreciation of art and nature. In other respects, quite logically following on the idea of nature's ideal order, Sulzer retains the basically Aristotelian idea of nature's complete purposefulness. Everything is built purposefully, fully, within each part, and viewed from outside, these parts together then create a beautiful form. Of course, the whole is not composed of only animate organisms, but also of so-called inanimate elements, water, fire, soil, minerals, everything forming a wisely ordered and mainly interconnected whole. And just as at the level of Earth, but also within the position of Earth among the other planets, additionally, Earth has a thoroughly balanced climate and temperature conditions, and even a small deviation could kill everything that is alive. So Sulzer works often emphasize the whole, and in this we can perhaps see a parallel with a much later text by Hepburn, which also examines in some detail the common theme of feeling of unity of nature. The feeling includes a broad scale of aesthetic experiences in nature understood as unity, up to the ideal of oneness with nature. Everything is well ordered, and then we even cannot conceive of a different kind of order. This harmony of perfection is not only in the whole, it is also in each part. Everything is perfect and presents the best variant. In the conclusion of dialogue in Interdisciplinary, Sulzer summarizes or lists the reason to admire nature. While nature and nature's beauty inspire our imagination, observing nature elevates also our spirit and leads us to the Creator. Experiencing the beauty of nature is the quickest and surest way to persuade people of the existence of the highest being. We find a similar motive in other texts that deal with nature's beauty, for instance in Shaftesbury's Moralists. As Sulzer, referring to Plato's recommendation, puts it, nature educates the spirit and humans shouldn't turn away from it. By studying nature, we try to understand the intention of the ruler of the world, and nature can also heal the spirit and teach the heart. And when we observe the order of nature, our moral sense develops. Moralische Geschmack. Nature offers both pleasure and learning, and we should send our children to school of nature, as Rousseau too advises. The last part. In comparison with Burke's or also Kant's work, Sulzer's conception of aesthetic experience of nature thus represents a rather traditional approach based on deriving nature's beauty from the Creator, believing in nature's objective beauty and basing aesthetic qualities on such order and on proportions. Despite such a traditional approach, however, Sulzer's views have remained a striking example of strong interplay between natural philosophy and philosophical aesthetics, a kind of interplay to which many of today's natural scientists and aestheticians may subscribe. But Sulzer's approach, as described in his Unterredungen, is unique in that this interplay doesn't involve only one field drawing inspiration from the other or using it as a supply of examples. In Sulzer's conceptualization, it is a serious attempt at a true interconnection of natural philosophy and philosophical aesthetics, and no other thinker since Sulzer's time has accomplished such a degree of interconnection of these two fields. Therefore, regardless of all the references to traditional order, form, mathematization, symmetry, and proportionality, for Sulzer, nature's beauty is based primarily on the beauty of the inner, hidden order, especially on the hierarchical organization of nature in the form of scala naturae, in the form of laws regarding the relationships and regarding the transformation of the forms in different environments. In Sulzer's work, there appear themes that we find later in writings of Hepburn, such as the possibility to change the scale toward the microcosm as well as to the macrocosm, the repetition of certain structures, the involvement of more than one sense, and the feeling of unity at various levels. Most significantly, however, in Sulzer's work, there appears a theme that is essential, for example, for Aldo Leopold or Alan Carlson. For aesthetic appreciation of nature, the hidden principles, connections, relationships, rules, and laws are more important than forms and colors than can be perceived by the senses. And these hidden laws can be communicated to us mainly through the sciences, not through art. For Carlson, it is the sciences that should replace the influence of fine arts in our aesthetic appreciation of nature, so that we may perceive nature as nature, not as art. Much has been written on this topic, and the argument between cognitivists and non-cognitivists has certainly been interesting in a broader context. It didn't concern only the sciences, of course. In this respect, Sulzer's work poses an interesting theoretical question to Carlson and others who want to base our aesthetic experience on knowledge of the sciences. What if this knowledge proves to be wrong in its fundamental theoretical underpinning, in its paradigm? That is a topic that at the end of the 20th century was practically left out of the discussion because of kind of blind confidence in the current state of science. But this, of course, doesn't detract from the importance of discussing the role of our knowledge, not only of the sciences, in the aesthetic experience of nature. At any rate, back then Sulzer brought up certain arguments and topics that are still interesting today. He also attempted to interconnect the field of aesthetics with the field of the sciences and, simultaneously, with the creative power of God. And he did so with a consistency and thoroughness that, since then, has been achieved by very few other thinkers dealing with this topic. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Karel. I think one of the things I'm taking from this is the optimism that if our books at first don't succeed, 200 years later they might. So thank you for that and for the fascinating presentation of Sulzer and his work. And now our second talk today is by Petr Husák, who also I don't know much about, but I do want to thank him for his work in Brno, organizing the people in Brno with their papers and things. So thanks very much for that, Petr. And I now hand over to you for your talk.
Dear colleagues, it's a pleasure for me to speak here at this conference, although I felt a little out of place when I realized that I should talk about beauty. But Jiří invited me at this conference, and he said to me, Peter, there will be a conference about beauty, and you can talk about your experience of the open landscape and nature, the vineyard and horses. But as I said, I felt a little out of place because I don't have a background in aesthetic studies, but I'm a historian by education and a vineyard worker by profession or by vocation, I say. So the care of the vineyards from whose grapes my brother makes wine has occupied most of my time for several years. So it has also been a source of livelihood for me, which has recently been slightly reflected, for example, in my ability to speak English and to a certain extent to understand. But I hope I'll be able to present a few reflections, partial thesis, and one specific hypothesis. Okay, firstly, something shortly about methodology. Firstly, I'd like to use some insights from my dissertation history. In the first part, the power of image and imagination. I will add some ideas to what Jiří said yesterday about imagination. And secondly, I'd like to theoretically grasp my own experience by making myself the subject of an experiment. Thus, I will try to analyze an experience of a person who has been influenced by university education, but lives mostly in a vineyard. I will try to contextualize my experience with some insights that I have been able to gain through the fact that I am to some extent part of a community of people who are trying to use horses in agriculture. And thirdly, I would like to propose one particular hypothesis based on a short content analysis of the activities of the Association of Private Farmers in Czech, Asociace soukromých zemědělců, and their magazine, the former Farmer Review in Czech, Selská revue. The first part, the power of image and imagination. In preparing my dissertation, I handled the question of the changing identity of Catholic priests in the 19th and 20th centuries through a biographical approach with comparative features. I work with three priests and other actors and lay believers. And in the context of the current topic, I find interesting an observation concerning the power of models or images that priests have allowed to shape and motivate their activities. I have attempted to trace concrete examples of the realization of the priestly vocation in my dissertation and later in my book. And in this context, I have tried to show the shaping of the priestly vocation by the confrontation of the priestly imagination with the priestly reality. For example, how various ideas, plans, dreams, evangelization programs, the contents of the official formation in seminary or specific form of piety, and above all, priestly models and images in German Priesterbild, adopted or newly created, manifested themselves in the environment of pastoral reality, and also how they were reflected in concrete activities and pastoral methods, and how the priestly imagination influenced the concrete pastoral preferences, actions, behavior and decisions of individuals. And the reality of such an image then didn't lie in its perfect translation into practice, but in fact that some priests were carried away or addressed and inspired by it, even if only partially and for a certain period of time. These images, for example, the image of the priest struggling for the human souls with the power of darkness, for example. So these images, nourished by concrete examples, ecclesial tradition or literature, had considerable motivational, identity-forming and pastoral potential. The advantage of studying the priestly environment is that the priestly vocation is probably more saturated with such images than many other vocations, I think. Moreover, priests were often literary active figures and members of the local elite, so many of them were accustomed to reflecting explicitly on themes related to the identity of their profession or vocation. Suppose, now, we attempt something similar for the farmers, for example, for peasantry. In that case, we must consider that the identity of the farmer or peasant is also reinforced by an awareness of hard physical work or labor and the pleasure of visible, tangible results, which may partly replace the need for explicit reflection and the reinforcement of one's own identity. But nevertheless, I think that the need for identity and its affirmation through the power of the image, through imagination, is generally human, and that therefore even farmers cannot function without it. The relationship between the past of the region or the landscape and the family creates the space for the formation and transmission of series of imaginative patterns, which are then linked to other images and symbols. For example, horse as a symbol of peasant freedom. These images can take on real motivational and identity-forming power that helps to overcome crises and grasp the situations we experience in our lives. And in this imaginative space, I see a framework in which aesthetic values and the idea of beauty are also applied. And I would like to demonstrate this by first analyzing my own experience. So the second part, because it's beautiful. So shortly, something about me. I came to work in the vineyards as a child. At first, I helped my parents, for whom the vineyard was a supplement to another jobs. I gradually started to help my brother, a winemaker, for a living. In the meantime, I completed all possible degrees in university studies in history. For some time, I worked as an employee of the Department of History in Brno, but at the same time, I decided to take my own responsibility for a specific locality in the southern Moravia, where we have 3 hectares of vineyards. It is a southern hillside with a small forest and a chapel dedicated to Virgin Mary, the top of the hill, as you can see in the forest. However, most of the vineyards were outdated, very old, and had to be renewed. I started working on this in 2012. In 2016, new vines were planted to complement the older ones. For me, this represented another milestone in growing closer to where I now spend most of my time. I began to see myself as an experiment. A university-educated person has taken up the vocation of vineyard worker in an open landscape. I even lived in a small cottage right in a vineyard for 6 months in 2016 to experience the landscape not only by day but also by night. I am therefore not one of the majority of people who visit the countryside and nature today mainly for recreational or tourist reasons. I'm a farmer who lives from work in the landscape. In this context, I was interested in the notion of the relationship between human beings and the landscape, according to which the landscape is a space of tensions. In the landscape, I experience home, a sense of belonging, acceptance on one side, but on the other also the harshness of the natural elements, like dry seasons and hailstorms and so on. On this picture, I try personally to retain water in the landscape. Okay. I'm therefore, I share not only the dialogue and harmony, but also the clash of cultural landscape and the wilderness, or even the clash of my own ideals and reality. I have come to understand that to survive these risks and tensions physically and spiritually, I also need to nurture my identity as a vineyard owner, but also as a person influenced by university studies. For my specific being in the landscape, I also came up with a working title which I can share with others. As you can see, the idea of the university in the landscape is just for me, but also for others, as you can see in the picture with children. So I try to explore and think about all possible connections with the place where I live. In addition, I also wanted to learn about some of the skills of previous generations. Above all, I wanted to discover the complex skills of working with horses, which today have practically disappeared from the Czech and Moravian countryside. As a university-trained theoretician, I have been exploring this skill on my own by trying to learn it for 2 years. To achieve this, my horse, 11-year-old gelding Samuel, the horse, helps me. Working with the horse provides me a space to reflect on the lives of my ancestors while also looking for ways to make meaningful use of the horse today. I experience the specific every day. I discover the language and way of thinking of the horse. I reflect on historical constants in the relationship between man and horse, man and land, and I look for differences and historical blind spots in our assessment of the past. I try to trace elements of continuity and to recognize breakpoints of discontinuity. To what extent I can extract something concrete from this, scientifically maybe, the future will only tell. Despite the above mentioned, however, I must emphasize that the primary motivation for me to start learning to work with horses was not only the desire to discover a complex skill, but also the powerful force of the image of the vineyard worker who, in cooperation with his horse, cares for his vineyards and small fields. From the beginning, this image struck me as primarily beautiful. And the beauty of this image, which has influenced the everyday reality of my current life, also helps me overcome the experience of tensions and anxiety that I also experience in the landscape. And it is essential to add that the image of the vineyard worker working with the horse led to my opening up to new skills and my exploring the other implications of bringing this image into reality. I realized that this image has a solid motivational and identity-forming potential and a recreational, emotional, marketing maybe, and ecological significance. Because of the horse's work, I don't have to drive the tractor as often in the vineyards, which eliminates soil compaction. The soil is then healthier, retains more water to serve the vines, and replenish the underground supply of drinking water, which is necessary for human life. And by cultivating the soil with the help of the horse, I can eliminate or exclude some chemical solutions. By studying you can see the plowing and cultivating the soil. With my father, we are testing a new finger weeder. Okay. In addition, by studying the phenomenon of organic matter in horse manure, I have discovered many connections related to the nutrient cycle in nature. Thanks to the horse, which enriches the straw with essential nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, I can participate in the so-called closed nutrient cycle. In addition, the decision to explore the skills associated with horse work has opened up a previously unknown world of a community of people trying to do something similar in the Czech Republic and abroad. They're often without interrupting traditional, for example, in Canada, USA, France, partly in Austria. And this allows me to learn about traditional ancestral practices and new solutions. And I then think about them and try to use some of them in our steppe or forest steppe landscapes. For example, some of the ideas of so-called regenerative agriculture, which uses the experience of restoring American prairies after the period of intensive agriculture. Or, for example, the idea of community-supported agriculture and the idea of carbon sequestration, which uses very often so-called cover crops. I use the same on my balks between the rows in the vineyards. And cover crops are important because they can help. It can help you to protect the soil against the erosion and to prepare food for soil biology. And also it can help to fight the process of desertification, which we can also see in the Czech Republic. Maybe it's also beautiful if you like the beauty of the desert, but please not in the Czech Republic. Because it's not a good idea to have the field, such field in such dry spring like this year, like that, because it's almost without any covering, without any life. And I took a photo. It's in the neighborhood of my vineyard, and in the same time, it's in the beginning of May this year. I took 2 photos in my vineyards where you can see the grass and which covered the space between the rows of the vineyard, and prepare place for the soil biology and also for other friends of mine, for other animals, as you can see in this picture. So the original image of a vineyard worker working with a horse, which I was primarily motivated to realize by aesthetic and identity-forming motivations, has ultimately produced various other effects that are positively manifested in the landscape I care for, I hope. So beauty matters in agriculture too. When I have tried to seek at least an informal answer to the question of what drives some farmers to start using horses in agriculture, in addition to mentioning ecological motivations, I almost always hear the telling argument, because it's beautiful. Okay. And the third part of my presentation, beauty also matters in agriculture. To conclude my paper, I would like to express one specific hypothesis that should be verified by interdisciplinary research at the intersections somewhere of history, aesthetics, sociology, and environmental studies, maybe. When we browse through publications on the aesthetics of nature and landscape, and in the Czech environment, we repeatedly encounter a key observation concerning the relationship between farmers and nature or wilderness. Karel slightly mentioned it. These reflections work with the thesis that the farmer's love of nature is an illusion. I mean farmer's love of nature and the wilderness is an illusion. These reflections work with the thesis that the farmer's love, indeed the forest, wetland, or the swamp were perceived by farmers as undesirable, dangerous, and bleak. The farmer fought against the natural wilderness. On the contrary, the ideal was a culturally modified, cultivated, and agriculturally used landscape. However, the technical possibilities of traditional agriculture were limited and therefore ecologically sensitive. Only intensive industrial farming was able to bring this idea to a perverse perfection, thanks to modern technologies, as you can see in the picture, and the desire for maximum financial profit. However, I would like to hypothesize that this way of thinking aesthetically about the landscape and natural wilderness has recently changed fundamentally in the environment of small farmers with a solid relationship to their ancestral tradition and the place where they farm. For example, like that. That's the joke. I have attempted analysis of the activities of the Association of Private Farmers, which was formed in 1998 after the secession from the Chamber of Agrarian Affairs. It's an association of so-called agro-holdings. And the Association of Private Farmers in Czech, Asociace soukromých zemědělců, left this Chamber of Agrarian Affairs because it is based on family farmers, family farms. And I have focused on its magazine, the Farmer Review, Selská revue, and its program, Varied Landscape, in terms of biodiversity and landscaping in Czech Pestrá krajina, in which farmers compete with their farming and landscape care projects. And based on this short research, I hypothesize that these farmers' decisions to participate in landscape projects whose primary goal is not agricultural production are reinforced by aesthetic motivations and ecological ones, and that aesthetic thinking about landscape and nature has changed among these farmers. The notion of beauty in the landscape is now primarily shaped by new knowledge of soil life and ecosystem or hydrological contexts, and diversity has become an attribute of beauty in the landscape. Diversity is shaped not just by the abundance of smaller fields, but above all by the presence of relatively free natural wilderness that is followed by fields or coexist directly with seeded crops. I mean shrubbery, groves, pools, wetlands, bogs, and cover crops. So a beautiful landscape is one in which previously displaced, unproductive natural wilderness is present. And such landscape is also healthier. So beauty, and indeed the specific content of the idea of beautiful, therefore matters a great deal in agriculture. Although the described idea of a beautiful landscape is not mainstream in the reality of Czech agriculture, I believe that one day it will be. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Petra. Wonderful. Made me think, well, a couple of things. Those of us who are academics who don't work in vineyards, we're academics who make use of the products of vineyards. So thank you. And the other thing, Jerzy was talking about the importance of truth in history. And I was thinking of in vino veritas, but you have also shown us in vino pulchritudo, so beauty in wine as well. So thank you. So now we have a chance for questions. Let me take this out of here. And I'll leave this one here. So questions or comments, please, to either of the two wonderful presentations.
Two comments on your paper, which I must say went very fast. There was a lot of information, so I may have missed it, so please forgive me if you said it and I just didn't hear. I think that when you go to Jena, you see the local saint is Ernst Haeckel. He really is considered a great local figure of great historical importance. And I don't think that you mentioned that he, in fact, was the inventor. He was the one to first, he created a new word, and the neologism that he was the origin of is ecology, ecologie. And it's interesting also that his word ecology applies in Ernst Haeckel's laboratory, I'm sorry, so it was all there, to the place of the relation of small forms of life with their environment. So if you said it, I take it all back. Then the second thing I wanted to say is that I invited Russell Ree Manning to speak about natural theology in British theology. And he talked to me about a book about which he talked about it as an everyday reading, extremely important for him. And it is Pierre Hadot, The Veil of Isis. And I had to admit at that time that I had never read the book, and then of course afterwards I did read it. And I don't think it was in your bibliography. So it's Pierre Hadot, Hadot, and of course you know it. But it's interesting because you showed the picture of signs unveiling nature, and Pierre Hadot is a study of the idea of nature throughout history, and Isis is nature, is Mary, in another context. But so nature is veiled because she's mysterious, and Science, who is a man, penetrates her mysteries, as Bacon famously said, and so it's very interesting. So Pierre Hadot.
Thank you very much for your comments. Yes, I forget the Hadot. He was even translated into Czech, so I suppose we know him. And it's one of the favorite books of my friend from the field of old Greek philosophy, etc. Also because it's very nice book which is cover quite a long period, and it's very very helpful. Regarding Haeckel, it's also I didn't mention him, but Haeckel it's a really interesting person which is dealing with beauty and connected it with science in a really interesting way, which is really dealing with Symmetriegefühl and with this traditional approaches, and he even supposed that the matter itself has aesthetic potential, and he is also a monist. So he is really connecting the spiritual side with the matter, and it's one of my favorite illustrators. So I use him or his pictures, but I didn't mention him in this lecture. But and the concept of ecology is his, and I suppose other German thinkers. For example, Karl Möbius wrote also aesthetic nature, and I suppose this is the concept of biocenosis, etc. And he's also a very interesting author. And Jakob von Uexküll with his term Umwelt, and so I suppose, but really it was a completely different field. And for example, as I've mentioned, my older department when I have a PhD, it was strongly connected with this German thinking. So not only Ernst Haeckel, but also Adolf Portmann, which is from Switzerland, and but this lecture was a bit sort of older book, because I was amazed by this author, which is some sort of dissident among the Enlightenment, but it was interesting. But so thank you very much. But of course, Ernst Haeckel is really number one in aesthetic of nature and sciences. Yeah. So thank you.
Can I have a question maybe for Petr, if I may. I was just thinking, so the title of your dissertation, which was, and it talks about touch. I mean, you're talking about touching. The priest reaches out his hands and touches. And I'm wondering, I've been thinking, we've been focusing a lot on sort of more visual beauty. And because I'm assuming that as a farmer, you have to touch lots of things. You know, you have to kind of use your hands, to put it mildly. So is there a beauty in touch, do you think?
That's a nice question. If it is beauty in touching, yeah, I think that it's, for me, I think that it's something very spiritual to touch the plants, and maybe the beauty is, as Katarzyna said, in a glimpse, in very short moments, because, as I said, I experienced some tensions and anxieties and risks, but if I have possibility to open my eyes in the morning and go to the landscape, to my vineyard, and see the grass and the green landscape around me, and I can also touch it through the work. yeah, it is something beautiful for me. But again, as Katarzyna said, it's very difficult to talk about such an experience. Yeah. But thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for both of your lectures. And it just came to my mind after Peter's lecture, memory of my childhood. Yeah, sorry? Yeah, okay, yeah, sorry. Yeah, just one memory, you know. I'm from Jihlava, which is not far from Brno. And my father lives in the middle of nowhere in a small village which is called Větrný Jeníkov, Windy Johnny, okay? And he always keeps hens and has a lot of eggs, and he just shares the eggs because he's not this type of man who is utilitarian, you know? And once a neighbor of ours asked him the question, Joseph, why do you have those hens if you even maybe don't eat the eggs? And my father's reply was, because it's just beautiful. And so it reminded me of my childhood. Thank you for it. You know, his answer was very unexpected, even for me as a child seeing this. And the neighbor was very much surprised. So it was the beauty, which was criterion, and still probably is for my father to have the hens in the yard. Thank you.
And I really tried to ask some people who uses horses in agriculture, and for a very long time, because I'm totally beginner in this field of, and I was really surprised that their answer was ecological and so on, but very often they answered to me because it's beautiful, and we see the elements of the beauty in it. Yes. That's a nice question. Yesterday, somebody mentioned the idea of Eucharistification of everything. It was very nice. And for me, I have a notion of the paradise, and or the kingdom of God, and it's located in my vineyard, in the small cottage I mentioned, and all mankind sitting in the vineyard with me and with Jesus Christ, and celebrate permanent Eucharist based on the grapes, the wines from our grapes.
Thank you very much for both of your lectures. So much to reflect on. I perhaps would have just one small question to Dr. Husák. You spoke about your dissertation, and I didn't have the privilege of reading your dissertation, and if I understand correctly, you were dealing with the way a priest imagines his role and how that image or self-image of the role of a priest is changing with time, right? I'm just wondering, because when you presented that idea, I somehow had to think about, well, and how about a possible tension between the self-image or the way the minister perceives his role or her role and the reality. Wouldn't there be a potential danger of some kind of projection or being somehow trapped in some kind of self-image which is conflictual with reality, perhaps? And I'm just wondering, have you been dealing with this sort of possible tension?
I can mention one particular example connected with one of the three priests I was writing about, and Antonín Ludvík Stříž. He was in the youth, in the young years of his life, very strongly connected with Josef Florian in Stará Říše, and with these images of priesthood. Very shortly, I mean the priesthood, which is connected with the Pope and ultramontane piety, with some revelations and so on and so forth, and live slightly against the authority of local bishops, and but very closely to some miraculous things, and Antonín Ludvík Stříž with Josef Florian create this or co-create this image, and after 8 years in Stará Říše, he was then in the First World War as a soldier, and tried to decide for to enter the seminary, and he saw himself in a spiritual crisis, because the idea of the priesthood he created with Josef Florian enabled him to make a decision, because it was very high ideal, and now he was in the position that he should fulfill this image, and for the certain time he couldn't decide because of this challenging image, but he overcome it and decide for priesthood. But in this moment, this is an example where the image which he also created was worked against him to certain extent.
Maybe I can have a question for Karel. Just one of the things that struck me when you were talking, and at the beginning when you were sort of introducing the changes in the way in which people saw nature and things, and from the sort of the English garden and the wild to the planned, and the planned to the wild, and back and forth, and all these sorts of things. I was thinking of the Jesuit reductions in Latin America, which are kind of basically a very planned thing within nature, within the forest or within the jungle, and then you build a very planned kind of city or town within that. And I kind of was wondering with Sulzer whether the beauty of nature, is nature beautiful if it's kind of in its place, or is it beauty? I mean, so nature outside of the town or something, or is it beautiful everywhere? Or is it only beautiful when it's kind of where it should be?
No, so I'm not Sulzer, but I suppose he thought about the nature everywhere, theoretically. It's not only a nature of Sanssouci, which is only one place he mentioned, but it's a more or less nature everywhere. But I suppose he traveled only around Europe. But he knows Alps, and then he lived in Berlin. So he he experienced the flat country with pines, etc. So I suppose he think about nature everywhere, like both nature and wild regions and also in cultural lands, but he wasn't experienced with.
I'm more thinking about would he see like the urban environment as a kind of natural environment, or would he see so nature is, you keep nature outside the city walls basically wherever you're living. Yeah.
I suppose this is the case. The nature outside, but it is not necessary. It's the same in Shaftesbury's writing, that it is not necessary to have a wild nature. It could be the nature of vineyards and etc. But definitely, it's not the town.
Yeah.
They are not the Rousseau is very strong in this position. You really hate town. But I suppose Shaftesbury and Sulzers are sometimes living in towns, but they are talking about the nature outside of the walls.
Yeah. Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, Pavel.
Thank you. Very briefly, I have a related question actually. Rousseau was mentioned several times, and this ideal of noble savage and kind of escaping the corrupt civilization, going back to the wild nature and so on, and that kind of tends to be classified as romanticist approach to nature, or being somehow part of the romanticist aesthetic perspective or approach to nature. And I was just wondering, as I was listening to both of your lectures, is there something in the way you relate to nature that would somehow resonate with this Rousseauian inspiration? You understand what I mean?
Yeah. So maybe I definitely like Rousseau and this approach. So I'm maybe much more focused on wilderness than in agricultural landscape. Yes, and but I enjoy it also. It's but as I know myself, I would prefer some wild forest. But in fact, I enjoy also, for example, České středhoří, which is mixture of woods and fields. Yeah, but maybe only a short comment to Rousseau. It's interesting that Rousseau is really focused on wild nature, the nature of Alps mainly, and the nature of islands. But he also appreciated village or countryside, with comparison to town. Yeah, it's still better than town. Town is really a horrible, corrupted place. But Rousseau is a bit pro-romantic because I suppose quite a lot of romantics enjoy even really danger nature and really deadly nature. Yeah, Nachtseiten der Natur. And I suppose Rousseau and Sulzer still the nature is something mild, something very very friendly. But when you read, for example, Macha, our poet, or Novalis, the nature could be really, really deadly place and dark, and in fact, it is. Yeah.
Just one comment, maybe that about the wilderness in the landscape, in the cultural agricultural landscape, and I've mentioned it in my presentation, and I think that the discussion about the landscape and the ecological issues and how we can help, for example, water to be retained in the landscape. I think that this is a topic in which some people from towns, or thinking very ecologically about, idealistically maybe about such things, are sometimes in a clash with farmers. But I think that is that it can be different in the future, and I see some patterns or some sides of the changing. Yeah, and on the other hand, I think that this topic can be a place where farmers, or maybe small farmers, I think ecologically and about the landscape, and that in this space of how we can see the healthier landscape. In this space, we can start a dialogue with some ecological movements and people from cities and so on, because sometimes for some people it's very, very important, but for another they say agriculture and such landscape, it's for 3 or just 1% of the society, because in agriculture works very small amount of people, and so on and so forth. But I think that it's not a good idea, because for example, water, we drink half of water we have from rain, and the second half we have from the underground, from the soil. And therefore it's very important, the discussion about the wilderness and about the presence of wilderness in landscape is important for the whole society, because it's about landscape in which we wanted to live, and it's also about human life because of the water in the landscape.
One last question, Pavel.
Thank you very much to both of the speakers, Karel and Petr. My question really kind of follows up on what Tim and Pavel asked about. I'm still thinking about this interaction between culture and nature. When you said that, for Sulzer, for example, there still would be difference between city, town, and even civilized landscape. I'm thinking about it in urban planning, ideally, that there is, or there should be, thought for, parks and this kind of environment even within cities. Because for many people today, living especially in large urban metropolitan areas, that they never even, some people never even get a chance to go outside the city they live in, perhaps. So that's just like how to, give these people kind of like a chance to relate to nature really in their lives sometimes. And as another idea, as a theologian, I'm reminded of the image of Revelations, the Apocalypse, the final chapters, John's vision of heavenly Jerusalem, where it seems to me, that nature kind of coexists with culture there. There is the idea of the trees are there, and the conception of the heavenly city. Temple is not there, interestingly enough, that the religious dimension is not there, but this oikumene, kind of connecting the words that people live in and ecological space that's there. So just a couple of ideas.
Maybe thank you for maybe this difference between culture and nature, and it's in last decade much more questioned, because the debate about Anthropocene, for example, in sciences and the humanities, it's still wondering if it's any so radical difference between culture and nature, and if there's any wilderness. In fact, there is no wild nature anymore. And yes and no, yeah. And so these discussions are quite intensive, I suppose. And for people of town, it could be also interesting, also for environmental movement, which was partly based on these ideas of wilderness, but also ideas back to land, back to agricultural country, and now it's really strong debates about these words, terms, concepts, and which are maybe really old, old-fashioned, and maybe we will think in completely different ways. But we will see. Yeah. So thank you for your comment. But it's starting point for other discussions.
Right. Well, once again, thank you both very, very much indeed.